All right, well, thank you all for being here. Thanks for that nice introduction, Doreen. I could tell it was hard for you to call me Danny instead of Daniel, but I appreciate that. So like I said, thanks for being here today. I want to start by kind of acknowledging that this isn't just my work, that this is work that happens with a few collaborators of mine, Dr. Angela Calabrese-Barton at Michigan State and Dr. Edna Tan at UNC Greensboro. But even much more so than that, with really hundreds of youth that we work with, and teachers, informal educators, community members, all trying to come together to think about what equitable science looks like and what that can look like in a classroom. And so today I'm not really going to talk through kind of a specific research project, but just research that's been going on over the past few years and kind of looking forward at what we want to do and what we want to accomplish. I will start though by saying that the title might be a little bit misleading. I'm not here to sort of define what an equitable science classroom looks like for you. I want to talk through some findings that we have with what youth have told us, what teachers have told us, what it looks like when we get these folks together and start talking about it. But the idea is that this work is ongoing and that we're trying to get to a space where we think of science classrooms as more equitable. Because unfortunately, what we definitely know is what an unequitable science classroom looks like. And you know, looking at both research and talking to our research participants and the people that conduct research with us, really showing the ways in which science classrooms can marginalize youth, especially youth of color from low-income backgrounds, and who are the youth that we're generally working with. And so today I really want to talk through kind of how we challenge that, and how the youth that I've worked with have challenged that, and the messages that they want to share with you around how they have expertise, lived experiences, and desires to take action. And then they want that to be happening in their science classrooms and their science learning experiences. And they want it to be legitimized by their teachers, by researchers, by adults. And we're going to share examples, or I'm going to share examples of some stories that youth have told us, experiences that they've had, and then talk a little bit through kind of what teachers have done with this, and where we really want to go from there. The last thing I'll kind of mention in this introduction is I was a middle school teacher. Silence from a crowd is bizarre to me. So if you have questions, comments, want to challenge anything that's being talked about, let's do it. No need to wait to the end. I'd rather have this be more of a dialogue than just me talking for the next however minutes. And so I wanted to start though letting you know a little bit about me. I was an 8th grade science teacher, enjoyed that immensely. And still really love working with middle school kids, but I've also had the opportunity to work in informal spaces, generally in boys and girls clubs, but also in museums and other types of science-related clubs in Lansing, Michigan, and Chicago, Illinois, and now here in Fort Collins, we have a program being run at the Boys and Girls Club. And my work with youth and teachers and informal educators, and my work as an 8th grade teacher has really kind of cemented a few commitments that I bring to my research and that hopefully you'll see kind of throughout this talk. One is that I'm committed to working with youth to design for opportunities to alter participation in STEM in ways that challenge traditional epistemic authority, values cultural community expertise, and builds towards action. And hopefully I'll be able to show you some examples of what that looks like today and really start talking about kind of the practices in science classrooms that we might be able to kind of implement to get towards this. So that kind of goes along with this other commitment that I bring to this, that's working with educators and youth to think about and design for more inclusive and equitable science learning environments, whether that's in schools, outside of schools. I do want to say this, you know, there's going to be some comments from youth that are highly critical of their school experiences, which I think are fantastic for us as educators to think about those spaces. This isn't about teacher bashing though, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the institutional pressures that teachers are under and the ways in which that manifests for science classrooms. I'm not going to talk a ton about theory and methodology today, but the theory that I bring to all of this work is critical. We've been really kind of leveraging critical justice in the work that we've been recently doing, but also have leveraged critical race theory, social practice theory, thought around critical ethnography methodologies, and YPAR, youth participatory action research methodologies. And I'm happy to answer any questions or open dialogue around those ideas, but really I want to be able to kind of share the work of youth, especially on a day where in Fort Collins we saw such a fantastic outpouring of youth voice as they walked out of school today and made their voices heard, which I'm proud to hear that happen. Okay, so why is this work so vital, and why do I think it's so vital? Well, these are things that maybe you've already heard before, but large barriers towards achievement in science persist, in particular for African American and Latina youth from lower income communities. We can kind of be very critical of the word achievement there, and I think we definitely should be very critical of the word achievement there. Yet, you know, in spaces such as the ones we're in, that achievement matters. And so we need to really think about how these sort of barriers towards achievement get manifested both in high school, and I know a lot of you do work at the university level thinking about that. These barriers exert enduring negative impacts, including limited access and opportunity for science-empowered futures. I like to think about that around majors in college and jobs, but also kind of voice in environmental and health injustices. My time in Chicago really showed me in the Pilsen neighborhood the lack of voice that community members had around the environmental injustices that were happening to them. And then that these inequalities are the result of accumulated historical, socio-political, economic, and educational practices and policies, which is kind of the systemic piece that we're trying to get at in the work that we're doing. So, as I think about this, though, that framing really kind of represents both past and future aspects of the issues that we're addressing. But the kids that I work with consistently remind me of the urgency of now, to think about what are we going to do now and today. And so what we're seeing in research is that youth from lower income communities of color disproportionately experience science and science classrooms as outsiders. That their expertise, their community knowledge, the things that they bring to the classroom are positioned in contrast to normative values in science classrooms and the science discipline, leaving many students thinking that science isn't for them, or that science classrooms aren't spaces where they can achieve. Even when there's a bunch of research Heidi Carlone and her group has done around, even when students of color from low-income communities achieve in school, they're much less likely to take on the identity of the good science student in that classroom. So even when school achievement is seen, messages are sent to these children that science isn't for them and that they are not able to achieve in science. Yeah?
Is that because the teachers are providing that feedback, or that's a self-perception?
Yes, and much more. So I think societal messaging to youth of color from low-income backgrounds is telling them that people who look like them, who live in their communities, are not going into science. And so it's reinforced in schools, it's reinforced in popular culture, social media, institutions such as this one, where youth come and visit and don't see students who look like them.
And also we're getting it from the school counselors because they're telling them to take cosmetology rather than taking math because they probably won't make it to college. So that's what our research is showing.
Yeah. Yeah, high school and counselors on university campuses as well, sort of pushing people into very normative ways of thinking about those things, most definitely.
What do the middle school students think science? What does that even mean? Like, is that part of it?
Yeah. So they, actually we're gonna get to that, but part of that is asking them to define what science that matters is. Because if we ask them to define science, generally that looks much different than science that matters to them. And I'll talk about that distinction here in a few minutes. Awesome, thank you for questions. If I hear my voice too much, that's not good for you or me. So I wanted to pause for a second though. I always feel a little bit uneasy about simply starting with framing the problem, right? That there are so many issues out here around participation and access for youth in science. And what that doesn't do though is, or what that ends up doing is sort of ignores the amazing things that kids are able to do and are doing. And so I wanted to pause for a second and introduce you to one of the youth that I've worked with. And think about, as we go through his story, I'd really like you to think about sort of these issues, right? The barriers to participation for him and the things that he's seen, but also to think about the possibilities. Think about what Jonathan is able to achieve and how he sort of addresses these barriers that come into his life. So I met Jonathan when he was a fourth grader. I was running an informal science program in Lansing, Michigan for grades 5 through 9. But as you got to know Jonathan, there was no stopping him. So as a fourth grader, he just kept looking in the windows, pounding on the glass. Every time I walked out of the door, talking to me. He wanted in, and who was I going to say to say no to him? He was ready to be part of it as a fourth grader. And so I got to meet Jonathan as a fourth grader. He's now a junior in high school, and we get to keep talking to Jonathan and understanding his experiences and the things that he loves to do. Jonathan would rather be here right now talking to you all, and has expressed interest in getting out of his high school classes to be able to do that. His mom wasn't as excited about that, so he and I put this story kind of together so that he asked me to share some of these details with you about him and the types of work that he does. So when Jonathan was a fifth grader, we were kind of getting to know the kids at the beginning of the year, and we asked them to just describe themselves. And so this is the picture that Jonathan drew of himself. And he described himself as sweet, funny, cool, and nice. And now this is a really important aspect of Jonathan and his identity, is this idea of funny. He's one of the funniest people I've ever met, and he prides himself on that. He prides himself on getting people to laugh, and he prides himself on making people feel comfortable. It's a role he always took on in this informal science group and in other places. That same time, if you might be able to tell, he just flipped the paper over and drew on the other side because we can kind of see that. This is his future drawing. What he'll be like in 20 years. Funny is still at the center of what he says. And he said he's either going to be a vet or work in the circus. Sort of trying to think about both of the things that he really loves, which was science and STEM, and his ability to sort of make people laugh and have fun. And we'll see how that plays out in a second. And thinking about how he defines science, kind of getting to that question, we asked the youth in our program, and I've asked teachers, I've asked all sorts of folks to do this activity, but we asked him what was his high moment in science. And that's how we framed it. Really open-ended, just what's the best moment you can think of in science. And so this is what he drew for us, walking home with his mother, telling the story that a lightning bolt had hit a power line. The lines snapped open, and he watched the sparks just fly all over the street. When I asked, how is this the high moment in science? I'm thinking this is a dangerous situation. And his mother did too. I got to know his mother really well. His idea, though, was really fascinating to me, that it tapped into his wonder. He had no idea that this is what this would look like when it split open. And it was this amazing thing that he saw every day, and he saw in a completely different light. In contrast, we asked him what his low moments in science would look like, or his singular low moment in science. And that's what he drew. So around this time, Jonathan was starting to have kind of a lot of issues in school in 5th and 6th grade. I would visit his school often and find him sitting in the hall, especially during science class. His teachers, when I asked his teachers about how he was doing and what was going on, they always said he's a smart kid, but he never stops talking. He wants to move. He's trying to make people laugh, and it's disrupting learning in our learning environment. And so we see Jonathan sitting in the hallway, and here we see him sort of tapping into the wonder. So, in some ways, really representative of the ways in which kind of barriers were put around Jonathan, and who he was, what expertise he brought to the table, and what community and life experiences he wanted to leverage in a science classroom. As a side note, we did this with a lot of kids, and this drawing, or a drawing of a textbook, comes up about 80% of the time. So he's either sitting still in a classroom, or they're reading out of a textbook. Please.
Danny, that
Yeah.
brings me to the question that I came here for today.
Okay.
I do a lot of work in school with restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
Our big concern is referrals. You talked about Jonathan being in the classroom. Anytime they're out of the classroom is a referral. Why is it we find over and over again the majority of referrals are from STEM classes? And what can we do to correct that? That's why I'm here today.
Why? I could throw some guesses out, but
The data is clear. I'm doing a study in New York State. It's
Okay.
clear all across the state. STEM classes are referring more often than any others.
So a guess that I would have is that what we think of as learning in science is very normative and behavioral. And so we put this sort of box around what students should look like. And yet then we put in front of them these sort of amazing things to be able to play around with, to discover, and then are not able to really think about how that disconnects for young children. That Jonathan wants to get in there and play with it and do these things is seen as a negative. He's not trying to pull people away from their learning. He's trying to get them involved, which I'll show you here in just a second. And so as teacher educators, parents, community members, and the youth that I talk to, we really need to rethink what that learning looks like in that classroom, I think. And that's part of what we're moving towards. I hope I answered your question, but if not, let's come back to it.
No, I'm really interested because I think the rethinking the learning is what I was looking for.
Okay.
How do science educators see rethinking the learning?
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of expertise in this room too that I think we could collaboratively talk about that idea. So as he's really struggling with science in 5th and 6th grade, he's choosing to come to an informal science group twice a week for several weeks in the summer, walking past at the Boys and Girls Club, the basketball court, computer lab, all these different things that he could be doing. He's choosing to come to a science group twice a week. And so we start talking about that and talking about the things that he does outside of school as contrasted with the things that he does inside of school. And one thing I'll note on this, where this happens and where that happens, that's another pattern we see with our students, that learning, their high moments, their dynamic moments with science are happening outside of school.
Danny, when you were saying that 80% of them have the textbooks and those are 80% when they're defining their low moments?
Yes, and I would go back to say that textbook or sort of a very passive looking classroom. So we started talking about this, and I said, so what would you want to tell your teacher then about the things that you do outside of school, and how do we tell them? And so Jonathan decided that he would write a letter. And so I want to show you the first line of the letter that Jonathan wrote. This is how he opened his letter. Before I show it to you though, he wrote this letter in November. School in Michigan starts right after Labor Day. It's state law. We can talk more about that later, about the economics of Labor Day weekend in Michigan. But this was written in November, and here's the first line of the letter.
Oh my gosh.
So 2 months into the school year, Jonathan starts a letter about the things that he can do with science by introducing himself to his teacher, by saying, hey, this is who I am and this is where I sit. Representing, a vision that his teacher has no idea who he is or what he can do. He goes on in this letter to talk about the things that he's doing with science. And so our group at that time had just received a donation of a whole bunch of CFL light bulbs, because it's a group that looks at kind of energy in connection to the places, the communities in which the kids that we work with live. And Jonathan wrote a letter about how he was going door to door, talking to people about switching CFL light bulbs, and using kind of narratives around how that switch at that time would be really good for both the environment, but also kind of the economic prosperity of their household. He gave out light bulbs. He wrote about this story to his teacher to tell them the types of actions and the things that he wanted to do with science. That year, we were learning about alternative sources of energy in our club, and we heard about a competition in the state of Michigan for middle school youth to produce public service announcements. And the kids that we were working with were super excited about the opportunity, because they had gained a lot of experience making movies and making them in accessible ways so that their community and other communities could kind of access their STEM knowledge and their STEM practices. And so Jonathan and his buddy decided to make a video. And it's short, 60 seconds long, but I wanted to show it to you and to have you think about how I've described Jonathan, and to think about what this video shows us. And we will see if I set up the audio right.
What the heck? This is rough too. Power sucking pig! There's another one!
The U.S. uses more electricity than all other countries except for China.
Did you know that solar panels could reduce your utility bills significantly?
Some people don't even have a utility bill because their solar panels or solar shingles provide all the energy that they need.
You can start saving energy by turning off and unplugging electronics when not used.
It's you!
So Jonathan and his peer there wrote that, edited it, chose the music, did all of that work, except for some of the footage I'm the camera person on. I think it really shows a few things about Jonathan. One, we were talking about sort of his use of humor. He came to me and said, Danny, I need pig noses. I'm like, what? You need to explain this idea to me, because this might be outside of my expertise. And so he talked to me about the power-sucking pigs idea and how he wants to make somebody laugh before he wants to make them learn. And so, but it also shows Jonathan's sort of understanding. He was fascinated by solar shingles, but his understanding of both kind of the environmental benefits of using solar energy, and also some of the economic kind of question marks that go out there. And some of my science methods classes, we show that video a bunch of times, and we think about what are all the messages that happen inside of that. I could talk about that video, but I'm going to let Jonathan say a little bit more about what this video meant to him. And I've been reading a lot of slides to you, and when I'm in an audience, that drives me crazy, so I'm going to let you read this one. And so one of the reasons I want to show you this is because when Jonathan had an opportunity to leverage his experience, his talents, his community knowledge, he was successful. He's pretty proud that his teacher now could see it and could see what he had done. This is the same teacher he was trying to reintroduce himself to in November. And as thinking around kind of the types of practices that we need to be having in science classrooms, the opportunities that we can present for youth. I think Jonathan's a really great example of that. And if we had a lot more time, I would just keep telling you stories about the kids that we've worked with and the things that they wanted to tell us. There's one more thing I wanted to show you about Jonathan, though. We interviewed him last summer to talk about what he wants to do with his life. And he said, I think I want to teach because I want to be like a cool teacher, because I don't like the teachers, like the bossy, real mean teachers. So I want the kids to have better teachers than that, so they will have me. I'll be nice and I'll teach them instead of just reading out of a textbook. So in this kind of 10th grader way of talking about this, Jonathan is really critical of learning in schools and critical of the ways in which teaching is happening in the schools that he's gone to. We kind of followed up and said, so where? And he said, I want to work right here. Our Boys and Girls Club site's right next to a school because I know it. I only went to 2 schools in my life. I really want to go to that one. And so he's talking about the ways in which this community matters to him, and that his community knowledge could matter to the way that he teaches, which we thought was a really, really powerful kind of way for Jonathan to be thinking about this. And I'm excited to see Jonathan as a science teacher, or whatever Jonathan decides to become as he keeps going. So, kind of reflecting and thinking back on Jonathan and kind of thinking about what we've talked about at the beginning of this talk. Now we circle back to this question: equity in school science. Is it possible? I'm going to try to say this next line with the most positive and hopeful voice that I can. There's renewed attention on equity in science education. The Next Generation Science Standards gives what I would call a nod to equity. The document that led to that Next Generation Science Standards has an entire chapter on equity. It's the 11th chapter out of 13 chapters in that book. And really doesn't take a critical stance on equity. But besides standards, as we push that aside, there's some amazing work happening in science education. One I would point you to is some work out of the University of Washington around ambitious science teaching practices that really are trying to attend to some of the equity issues in science education. But the group that I work with, what we've kind of been thinking a lot about is that the ways in which we're trying to address equity in science education is largely at the individual level. If we help this kid or these groups of kids, then their opportunities to learn will be impacted. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You know, if I saw Jonathan in a classroom, I'd want to work with him. But what it really kind of ignores is the systemic issues that happen in schools, and that really Jonathan is pointing to. And so without attention to these systemic concerns, such as systemic racism and other forms of inequality, and how they manifest in local classroom practice, school reform efforts in these high poverty districts fail to have lasting impacts. So as we just focus on things on the individual level, we're going to miss ways to impact not only Jonathan and the youth that I work with, but all youth, and thinking about how do we really kind of address these systemic issues that keep coming up in schools, and really that kind of drive what happens. And so we've kind of come up with an idea, and we've piloted it. And we're calling it Equitable and Consequential HLPs. And I apologize, I probably should have wrote out what HLPs are. They're high leverage practices. So in educational research, K-12 educational research, we think of these practices as ones in which both novice and expert teachers can implement in their classrooms, that are based on research, and are really focused on, the ones that we're thinking about are really focused on addressing equity issues in science classrooms. So we think about the equitable piece of these high leverage practices as teaching practices that expand opportunities for all youth to engage in science in culturally sustaining and rigorous ways. So both thinking about the discipline, but also thinking about the lived experiences that our students bring to the classrooms. But we also think around consequential, which I think consequential takes and turns the idea of relevance on its head a little bit, and really thinking about outcomes of doing science aimed at addressing these systemic inequalities and their interactions in classroom practices, such as supporting student agency and disrupting power dynamics in classroom, science, and society. And so we watched, well, some of us were there, but some of us were watching on TV today as students walked out of schools in Fort Collins, and hopefully we're supporting student agency in these ways, but also thinking about how do we help the youth that we work with and the teachers that we work with think about expanding outcomes of what it means to participate in science and what it means to learn science. So I want to come back, though, to youth voice and the ways that they're thinking about this. Because what we're seeing in the literature and in our own research experiences is that this equitable and consequential learning that we're really hoping to get towards is happening in informal spaces, but not so much in formal spaces, not in school. We saw Jonathan's high and low picture contrasting informal and formal. There's a lot of work out there really looking at this kind of divide. And in some ways, our work is trying to bridge that divide. There's powerful learning opportunities in formal science. So what can we learn from that and bring into science classrooms? And so we bring in then kind of the voice of Samuel. And we were talking my colleagues were talking to him last year, and he said, teachers care, but they don't know enough about our communities. We go outside on our time, find places where we go do science or engineering for our communities. School doesn't know how to do that. School doesn't know that we do that. We need to tell our teachers how we do it. We need to tell them why we do it. And so that was kind of his remark in terms of he had just built a little free STEM library. As one of the projects that he wanted to engage with. He had LED lights that were powered by a solar panel. I could geek out on some of the science stuff for you. But really what Samuel and one other youth who made this really wanted to address an issue they saw in their community, which was that the kids that they knew and went to school with didn't have access to STEM materials. They put making materials in this. They put books on how to make and how to design and how to tinker in there. And Samuel then coined a term that at least I hadn't heard before, that one of the reasons he did this was because they were living in a library desert. And that access to materials and access to the types of things that they got to do in this informal science club. My computer wants to run an update, I'm sorry. Were not available. Nice. To students in that community. And so I think, Samuel's words are really a call for the types of practices that we're talking about, these equitable and consequential practices, and how can we bring these into science classrooms. So a lot of this work then is based on talking to kids, as Doreen brought up, and asking them about science that matters. And so when we ask them to define science or tell us about science in their schools, they often tell us about kind of this need to pass because they need to get on to the next grade and do so that they can graduate or they can get jobs and different things like that. It's hard for them to sort of connect the science they're learning in schools to their lives and their communities in other ways than just sort of getting past this gateway. But as we talk to some of the youth that we worked with and asked them to define the term science that matters, which is a term that they coined. And they coined that term in an activity where we were building websites And the question one of the questions we wanted them to kind of address on the website is, what do you like about science? And I saw these 4 young women raise their hands. They were always working at a table together. And I figured they were having problems thinking about the actual technical piece of building a website, which I was ridiculous to think that, because they had so much more computer knowledge than I did. So I went over there and I asked them what the problem was, and they said, I don't like anything about science. Once again, these are youth that come to an informal science program twice a week. They come all summer. If I go in on Friday to see what's going on, they were coming over to do science. And yet they were telling me they didn't like anything about science. And so I said to them, but why are you here? Why do you keep coming here? And they said, oh, because the science we do here matters. And so from that conversation, we tried to uncover what that actually means. And so I don't know how I'm doing on time. I'm probably going, oh yeah. So I'll kind of quickly go through this, but it sort of broke down to a few things. Science that matters is a connection to a commitment to their community. It's a piece of, it's a way that bridges science in their community in ways that connect to who they are, who they care about, and where they live. It also comes with these outcomes that I talked about a little bit earlier. Sort of action or transformative outcomes, ways to make a difference, ways to impact their community, ways to teach others, ways to do something with what they know. One of the things they kept talking about to me was they were tired of being passive and listening, which is ironic because I've been talking now for 40 minutes. And then finally, they talked about the barriers that were presented to them in school, and how they try to navigate those barriers through bridging practices and bridging science in their community. And I'm happy to talk a lot more about that. But a lot of this work is really based on some of these ideas and prior research around youth voice around science that matters. And so we've kind of launched a project and just submitted a grant to keep this project going, but we've done some pilot work around some research and practice partnerships to bring together stakeholders to think about how do we make science classes more towards this equitable and consequential, and what are the practices that might support that type of learning. So we put youth at the center and sort of center their voice and their experiences, and have them in conversations with teachers and informal educators and community members and researchers to really think about what does equitable and consequential learning look like, or science that matters look like, and how can that actually happen in classroom spaces. And so I know I'm pretty much running out of time, so I'm going to give you some kind of at least one practice that has come out of our kind of pilot work that we've done with teachers and youth and informal educators and community members, which we are calling recognition work. And so recognition work has a few different aspects to it. One is that it has pedagogical moves or teaching moves. One, to notice and value students' cultural knowledge and practice as important forms of epistemic authority. So think back to Jonathan and the ways in which not only could he bring that in, his cultural knowledge and practices, but they were valued and legitimized. And that for teachers to respond and leverage in ways that integrate students' cultural knowledge, practice, this disciplinary knowledge we want students to learn, and their desire to transform existing institutional and societal barriers to participation and success. So we've thought around some pedagogical moves that teachers can utilize to be able to do this and open up space for their students. But it's also a stance. It's a stance that this type of learning will impact opportunities and achievement in science through redistributing power, challenging those traditional racialized power hierarchies, expanding views of what is legitimate expertise in a science classroom, and then bridging those outcomes of participating in science with student agency, allowing them spaces to do something with that. So I want to give you one really quick example, and then I'm going to stop talking so we can have a conversation. But this was an example with an 8th grade teacher that we had worked with. He was an ex-Marine. I had been in his class a lot. His class was about order in a lot of ways, but he really, really showed kids that he cared for them. He was part of a professional development opportunity that we put together where it just foregrounded the kids' stories, websites, voices of science that matters. The 4 girls that I showed you were the center of that professional development experience, and he was part of that experience. And so he was a guy that talked a lot about the institutional pressures that are on teachers, standards, testing, the principal wants me to do this, all of those things, which are very real. They're very, very real. But it also, the kids' voices and experiences and the types of videos and things they wanted to show him got to the point where he couldn't ignore it anymore. And so he said a few things. One is, I know standardization's not the right thing. I know children learn in a variety of different ways. I also know that our focus on curriculum doesn't take into account things like art, creativity, community involvement, like she's talking about. I don't know, we take the soul out of learning. He's implicated. The kids implicated him. There was he couldn't hide anymore. And in some ways, all the teachers that were part of this pilot work got to that space. The first few meetings, they were like, but, we can't, I can't. By the 4th meeting, they all said, so how do we transform our curriculum to ensure that kids have these types of opportunities? And that sort of sounds like I'm patting us on the back. It's not us at all. The kids just kept saying it enough to say the teachers couldn't run away from it anymore. And so he took some steps in his classroom. And so he rearranged one of his units towards the end of the year, that's different, around an inventions project. He taught physics. NGSS had just put engineering design into the curriculum, and we said, well, why can't the kids create something? Why can't we do this? So he and I got together and thought about a project. And one of the days that I was in there, this was one of his quotes, is to say, the purpose is to showcase your ideas, talents, and ability to connect science with your life outside of school. And kids were asked to invent. They invented some amazing things as far as I'm concerned. Glow-in-the-dark backpacks for safe travel home. An app, a kid built an app to connect organ donors to those that need it. We're talking 8th graders, right? 8th graders who can do amazing things when we get out of their way. What was the other one? It's in Michigan. So a kid designed heated boots and wanted to make heated boots very affordable for all of his friends because they hang out outside. And it's a really nice thing. I would have purchased those for sure. But really what this shows is that this opportunity, these students were taking this opportunity and really running with it. We provided a framework. Actually, he provided a framework to do this work. And then he started talking about how he saw participation from students that generally weren't participating in his class. So it's a start towards some practices that open up space for youth to really kind of bring in and see their expertise, their lived experiences, and their interests legitimized in a science classroom in ways that generally aren't, and ways that Jonathan showed us that were really impacting the way he thought about his future. So I'm going to end with with this statement that's really written in academic speak, but really comes from the work that we did with youth and kids, and really kind of talks through our commitment. And it says, we take the stance that youth lives, interests, and cultural knowledge as reflections of both individual experience and systemic narratives matter, and are crucial elements of how students and teachers might collectively engage disciplinary knowledge substantially and with agency to make a difference in their lives and their communities. And so I think that statement really is kind of a foundation for the work that I want to do and the work that I engage with youth and teachers. So that's that.